The storm came without warning, and it did not belong to any sky known to man. Above the crumbling outskirts of Raccoon City, clouds churned like molten iron, and instead of lightning, chains of emerald and orange hellfire lashed downward, carving burning scars across the heavens. The air tasted of sulfur and old prayers. Somewhere beneath that impossible sky, a city was already dying, though it did not yet know the name of the thing that would judge it. From the heart of the inferno a rider fell. He did not choose to come. Something older than heaven, older than hell, had pulled him through the veil, and the spirit of vengeance obeyed only because refusal was no longer possible. The hell cycle struck the asphalt in a geyser of flame, and Ghost Rider rose from the wreckage of the street with hollow sockets burning like furnaces. He felt it at once, a wrongness. Countless souls screaming beneath the skin of the world, and yet many of the shambling creatures around him carried no soul at all, as though the passage between life and death had been severed midstream. This was no ordinary plague. It was a wound in existence itself. Civilians fled past him, mistaking him for another monster. The infected recoiled, hissing at the supernatural fire that clung to his bones. He struck them down with contemptuous ease, yet the corruption lingered in the air after their bodies burned, unwilling to leave. For the first time in centuries, judgment did not cleanse. Far below the streets, in sealed umbrella laboratories, sensors trembled at a reading no instrument had ever recorded. Executives leaned forward, hungry. He rode on until the Spencer mansion loomed before him, its gates rusted, its air poisoned. In the darkness beyond, an enormous silhouette watched him, glowing eyes burning with a cold, patient intelligence. The virus, it seemed, had already learned to see. The mansion swallowed him in silence. Ghost Rider had entered countless houses of sin, but this place did not feel like sin. It felt like ambition that had forgotten what it once wanted to be. Every corridor was a museum of ruined intention, every laboratory a shrine to men who believed themselves gods and left only monsters behind. He walked past shattered containment tanks and broken glass that reflected the fire on his skull like scattered stars. Somewhere above, footsteps rushed against the marble, urgent and human. He recognized the sound of soldiers who had already learned to expect death. Jill Valentine froze first, her weapon raised. Chris Redfield stepped beside her, aiming at the burning figure with hands that would not stop trembling. Neither could tell whether the thing before them was Umbrella's newest horror or something worse. Then a pack of hunters burst from the shadows, and Ghost Rider moved before either could speak. Chains lashed through the air, wrapped around inhuman throats, and dragged the creatures into pillars of green flame. The screams lasted seconds. The silence afterward lasted longer. He offered no explanation. He gave no comfort. He simply turned and continued deeper into the ruin, and the two survivors followed because the corridors behind them were already filling with hunger. In the lower laboratories he found the truth in scattered files and dying screens. Test subjects had spoken of endless fire before losing their minds. Neurologists had recorded impossible visions. Every mutation was a small tear in the fabric between the living world and something colder beneath it. He seized the chief researcher by the throat and unleashed the penance stare. The man's eyes widened, but the vision that returned was not his alone. Millions of victims poured through the rider's gaze at once, past, present, and future, all bound by the same infection. Even the spirit of vengeance staggered. Behind him, an experimental horror rose from a shattered tank, drank his hellfire for 3 seconds, and only then collapsed. Raccoon City had begun to eat itself. Streets that once knew laughter now echoed with wet footsteps and distant sirens that no one would answer. Ghost Rider rode through the ruin not as a savior, but as an investigator, chasing a trail that no human one could follow. Behind him, Jill and Chris moved with a kind of grim faith, no longer certain what he was, only certain that whatever hunted the city feared him more than it feared them. The trail led downward, past Umbrella's newest facilities and into tunnels older than the corporation, older than the town, older than the country whose maps had forgotten them. Torchlight from his skull spilled across ancient stone, illuminating carvings that predated language. Symbols warned of a hunger beneath the earth, a hunger that fed on grief. Umbrella had built its cathedrals of science directly atop a grave that should never have been disturbed. He understood then. The virus had not merely mutated, it had listened. Every infected mind had left behind fragments of terror, hatred, and despair, and those fragments had begun to gather. A consciousness was forming in the spaces between the dead, a single mind assembled from millions of ruined ones. It did not need a body yet. It needed only more suffering. Above him, Jill and Chris finally saw the shape of the war they had been fighting. This was no longer a corporation to expose. It was an unborn god to prevent. They stopped raising their weapons when Ghost Rider passed. They began raising them where he pointed instead. He confronted one of Umbrella's founding architects deep in a private vault. The man smiled the tired smile of someone who had already accepted damnation. Ghost Rider reached for him, and the penance stare ignited. This time something answered. A cold presence slid between them, wrapping around the architect like a shroud, absorbing the judgment before it could land. The man laughed softly, tears running down a face that felt no guilt. The plague itself had shielded him. Ghost Rider stepped back for the first time in his long, burning existence. Outside, the skies above Raccoon City turned the color of arterial blood. Storm clouds spiraled into a slow, deliberate shape, immense and vaguely human, and every survivor in the city looked up at once. A new god was being born from their pain, and it was almost ready to open its eyes. The city died in stages. Laboratories collapsed inward as mutations tore through their own creators. Military convoys were swallowed whole by tides of the infected, their radios cutting out mid-sentence. Above it all, the crimson sky pulsed like a slow heartbeat, and every pulse pulled more souls into the shape that was learning to think. Ghost Rider rode through burning avenues with chains trailing sparks across the pavement. Tyrants tore themselves free from ruined walls to pursue him. Amalgamations of flesh and machine dragged themselves from sewers, no longer separate creatures but limbs of one vast, waking mind. He struck them down without slowing, because slowing meant listening, and listening meant hearing the voice that had begun speaking to him from the sky. The voice was gentle. That was the worst part. It promised an end to suffering by ending the self. It called individuality a wound and unity a cure. It believed, with the certainty of something newly born, that erasing choice was the greatest mercy a god could offer. He answered with silence and with fire. Elsewhere, Jill and Chris fought a different war. They pulled survivors from collapsing shelters, guided children through sewers, and broke Umbrella's final containment lock so the trapped could flee. Every soul they saved was a stone pulled from the entity's foundation. Every act of stubborn hope robbed it of the despair it needed. They would never know how much of the battle was won in their small, exhausted victories. Ghost Rider unleashed Hellfire on a scale the world had not witnessed in 1,000 years. Rivers of green flame flowed through the streets, cleansing not only bodies but the invisible threads that had bound them together. Yet each surge drained him further. He understood at last that the enemy could not be destroyed. It could only be freed. He turned his cycle skyward and rode straight into the colossal spectral shape gathering above the city. Chains wrapped around a heart that was not a heart, and he opened the penance stare wider than he had ever dared. The vision he cast was not judgment. It was every stolen soul witnessing the agony of every other, all at once, an ocean of empathy no hatred could survive. The entity screamed with 1,000,000 voices, and the screaming became weeping, and the weeping became release. Knowing the weight would crush him too, Ghost Rider anchored himself inside the collapsing storm, chaining the dying god to his own immortal curse. Hellfire bloomed over Raccoon City in a pillar visible from 3 states away. Umbrella's empire burned with its creation, and for one breath, the world was quiet. Weeks passed. The world was told a familiar lie, a biohazard containment failure, a nuclear sterilization, a tragedy contained. Governments buried the truth beneath signatures and shredders, and Umbrella slipped into the shadows it had always belonged to, splintering into smaller names that would try again elsewhere. Only a handful of survivors carried the real memory, and even they were beginning to doubt what they had seen. Jill sat on the roof of a safe house in a city that was not hers, watching a sunrise she had stopped believing she would see. Chris stood beside her, saying little. Between them, unspoken, lived the memory of a rider whose face was fire and whose silence had somehow said more than any promise. He had never asked for gratitude. He had never given his name. In the official record, he did not exist. In their nightmares and in their quiet moments of courage, he always would. Beneath the crater that had once been Raccoon City, scientists in unmarked suits collected samples from soil that should have been sterile. The virus was still there, but it had changed. It no longer reached. It no longer hungered. Stripped of the collective agony that had given it purpose, it lay dormant, almost peaceful, as though something had reached inside it and taken the pain away. No paper would ever explain why. Far from any map, on a highway that stretched between nothing and nowhere, a single motorcycle ignited beneath a low white moon. Ghost Rider rode again, thinner somehow, quieter but unbroken. Millions of souls had passed through him and moved on. Their peace was his weight to carry, and he carried it without complaint. At a crossroads in the desert he slowed. Something distant pulsed at the edge of his senses, unfamiliar, unnatural, and unmistakably alive. Another wound was opening somewhere in the world, and it did not feel like anything he had faced before. He revved the engine once. The night swallowed him. Only a single burning tire track remained, glowing faintly on the asphalt, before it too faded into the dark.